The Great Hall of the Galactic Council stretched high above the gathered delegates, its crystal dome showing the stars of 1,000 worlds. Ambassador adjusted his silver scales and watched the members of the galactic community take their seats at the circular table. The humans looked so ordinary. Had lived for over 3,000 years. He had seen species rise and fall, watched empires burn, and new ones emerge from their ashes. In all that time, he had learned to read the signs that marked a dangerous species. They had natural armor that could stop plasma bolts, that could read thoughts and bend minds to their will. The synthetic could process information faster than any organic brain. But these humans from the small world called Terra, they had soft skin that would tear easily. They were so short they barely had time to learn wisdom before they died. They carried no visible weapons and wore simple blue uniforms instead of battle gear. "Distinguished members of the council," said the human who stepped forward. She was a small woman with dark hair and kind eyes. "I am Ambassador Sarah, speaking for the United Earth Government. We are honored to join this community of peaceful worlds." Noticed how she spoke each word clearly, how she looked each delegate in the eye as she spoke. Most new species either cowered before the council or tried to show off their strength. The humans did neither. "We come not as conquerors or traders seeking only profit," Ambassador continued. "We come as friends who wish to share what we have learned and learn from your wisdom." Around the table, other delegates shifted in their seats. The hive speakers clicked their mandibles in what might have been amusement. The gas-form ethereals pulsed with colors that suggested boredom. This was the same speech every peaceful species gave when they first joined. Ambassador activated a holographic display that filled the center of the hall. Images began to flow past the watching delegates, paintings that seemed to capture light itself, music that made even the synthetic pause in their constant data processing, stories and poems that spoke of dreams and hopes. "This is what we offer," she said. "The art of our world, the stories of our people, and our commitment to peace." Delegate Eth of the Supremacy let out a sound like grinding stone. "Pretty pictures will not feed hungry worlds or stop raiders from attacking trade ships." "That is true," Ambassador agreed with a smile. "That is why we also propose expanding the humanitarian aid program to colonies in need. Earth has developed new farming techniques that can grow food in hostile environments. We offer these freely to any world that needs them." Leaned forward slightly. Most species guarded their useful knowledge carefully, trading it only for resources or favors. These humans wanted to give it away. "What do you want in return?" asked Prime Calculator of the collective, his mechanical voice sharp with suspicion. "To be part of something greater than ourselves," Ambassador said simply. "To help build a galaxy where all thinking beings can live in peace." The hall fell quiet for a moment. Then Delegate Eth laughed, a harsh sound like metal scraping against stone. "Another species of dreamers. They will learn soon enough that the galaxy is not kind to the weak." Watched Ambassador's face carefully. For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. It was gone so quickly he might have imagined it, but it reminded him of something dangerous. The formal presentations continued for hours. Each delegate spoke of their people's history, their achievements, their place in the galactic order. When it came time for the humans to share their past, Ambassador stood again. "Our people have a long history," she began. "We have made many mistakes and learned from them. 200 years ago, we entered what we call the Long Peace. Since then, we have focused on art, science, and helping each other build better lives." 200 years, thought. For a species that claimed to be thousands of years old, this seemed remarkably short. What had happened before this long peace? "What ended your previous era?" he asked, his ancient voice carrying across the hall. Ambassador paused for just a heartbeat before answering. "We learned that some paths lead nowhere good. We chose a better way." It was not really an answer, but before could ask more, the session moved on to trade agreements and territorial discussions. The humans proved to be careful negotiators who asked for very little and offered much. They wanted only a small number of worlds for their growing population, and the right to send aid ships to colonies in need. As the day wore on, found himself more curious about these strange newcomers. They spoke often of choice, of deciding to be better than they were. Most species talked about what they were, what their nature demanded. The humans spoke as if they could simply choose to be different. During a break in the proceedings, he approached Ambassador. She stood by one of the great windows, looking out at the stars. "Your people interest me," he said carefully. "This long piece you mention, what came before it?" Ambassador turned to look at him, and again he saw that flicker in her eyes. "We call it the time of madness. Our people forgot how to be human for a while. We remembered, and we chose never to forget the lesson again." "And what lesson was that?" "That just because you can do something does not mean you should," she said quietly. "That power without wisdom leads only to destruction. That the strong have a duty to protect the weak, not prey upon them." Nodded slowly. Wise words, but wisdom is often hard to maintain when others do not share it. Ambassador smiled, and for a moment her whole face seemed to light up. "That is why we must try even harder to remember it." As the formal session resumed, found himself watching the human delegation more carefully. They were polite, helpful, and genuinely seemed to care about making the galaxy a better place. They laughed at jokes, offered help when other delegates struggled with technical issues, and never once tried to push their own agenda forward at others' expense. They were, by all appearances, exactly what they claimed to be: a peaceful species that wanted to help and be helped in return. So why did feel like he was missing something important? The session ended with the formal acceptance of Terra into the Galactic Council. Ambassador bowed deeply to the assembled delegates and promised that her people would work hard to earn their place in the galactic community. As the delegates began to file out, chatting among themselves about trade routes and territorial agreements, remained in his seat thinking. Something about the humans bothered him, though he could not put his finger on what it was. Perhaps it was how easily they had accepted the casual dismissal from other delegates. Perhaps it was how they spoke of their past as if it belonged to different people entirely. Or perhaps it was that flicker he kept seeing in their eyes, like a flame that was banked but not extinguished. Whatever it was, decided he would watch these humans carefully. In his long life, he had learned that the most dangerous beings were often the ones who appeared the most harmless. The humans had joined the galactic community, promising peace and friendship. Time would tell what that promise was truly worth. 6 months had passed since the humans joined the Galactic Council, and Ambassador had almost convinced himself that his worries were nothing more than the paranoia of old age. The humans had kept every promise they made. Their aid ships brought food to struggling colonies. Their scientists shared farming techniques freely. Their artists filled the galactic networks with beautiful music and stories. Then the reports started coming in from the outer rim. Read the first incident report with growing concern. A human merchant vessel, the Peaceful Dawn, had been attacked while carrying medical supplies to a colony suffering from crop failure. The attackers were members of the militant hegemony that controlled several systems in the frontier regions. They were an old problem. They were large reptilian beings who believed that strength was the only virtue that mattered. Their society was built around conquest and dominance. Most civilized species had learned to avoid their territory and accept the occasional raid as the price of peace. The human ship had been captured. Its crew of 12 had been taken as slaves. The medical supplies had been dumped into space. Ambassador had filed a formal complaint, requesting council intervention to secure the release of her people. The complaint was discussed, debated, and eventually filed away for further consideration. This was the standard response. They were dangerous to fight and expensive to negotiate with. It was easier to let them have their occasional victories. But the attacks did not stop. 3 weeks later, another human ship disappeared. Then another. They began broadcasting their captures, showing human prisoners in chains as proof of their superiority. Warprime OK himself appeared in the broadcasts, his massive form covered in scars from countless battles. "See how the weak mammals cry," he roared, his voice echoing through space. "The Council sends soft words while we take what we wish. Who will stop the mighty hegemony, these pathetic creatures who paint pictures and sing songs?" The broadcasts were meant to humiliate the humans and show the galaxy that the Council was powerless to protect its own members. Most species had endured similar treatment when they were new to galactic politics. It was considered a cruel but necessary lesson in how the galaxy really worked. Watched Ambassador during the emergency council sessions that followed each attack. She remained calm and professional, always following proper diplomatic procedures. She filed the correct forms, made the appropriate requests, and waited patiently for responses that never came. But he noticed small changes. The way her hands gripped her data pad a little too tightly when casualty reports arrived. How her aide, a young man named, had to take several deep breaths before reading the latest prisoner lists. The slight pause before Ambassador said "thank you" when another request for intervention was. The other council members seemed to view the situation as unfortunate but normal. "The humans will learn," Delegate Eth said with casual cruelty. "Every species must pay this price when they enter galactic politics." But remembered his conversation with Ambassador about the time of madness. He began to research human history more deeply, using his diplomatic access to dig into their records. What he found made him increasingly uneasy. Humans had indeed fought wars before their long peace, wars that made even his ancient mind struggle to process the scale of destruction, weapons that could crack planets, poisons that could kill entire ecosystems, conflicts where humans had created technologies so dangerous they threatened their own species' survival. Most disturbing of all were the tactical reports. Humans had not just fought with brute force. They had shown a genius for strategy that was both brilliant and terrifying. They studied their enemies with scientific precision, found weaknesses that others missed, and exploited them with ruthless efficiency. Yet here they were, asking politely for help and accepting refusal with patient dignity. The crisis reached its peak when the attacked station, a human research facility studying peaceful alien life forms. The station had no military value whatsoever. It was staffed by scientists, teachers, and their families. The youngest victim was 6 years old. 847 humans died in the attack. The broadcast their victory across the galaxy, showing the burning remains of the research station, while Warprime OK declared that this was what happened to species that showed weakness. Watched Ambassador receive the casualty report during an emergency council session. For just a moment, her professional mask slipped. The pain on her face was raw and terrible. Then, like a curtain falling, the calm diplomat returned. "Honored delegates," she said, her voice steady despite the horror of what had just happened. "I formally request immediate council intervention to stop these unprovoked attacks on civilian targets. The hegemony has now committed acts that by any civilized standard constitute crimes against sapient life." The debate that followed was painful to watch. Some delegates expressed sympathy for the human losses but worried about the cost of military action. Others pointed out that the Outer Rim had always been dangerous and that new species needed to learn to protect themselves. A few suggested that the humans had been naive to put a research station in such a vulnerable location. The final vote was close, but intervention was by a single vote. Several delegates who might have supported action were swayed by Delegate Eth's argument that the Council cannot fight every petty warlord in the galaxy. The humans must learn to stand on their own. Ambassador listened to the result without expression. She stood slowly and looked around the chamber at delegates who had been debating the value of human lives like it was a trade agreement. "I thank the Council for their consideration," she said with perfect diplomatic courtesy. "Terra understands that we cannot expect others to fight our battles for us." She paused for a moment and saw something shift in her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Still polite, still professional, but with an undertone that made his ancient instincts suddenly scream warnings. "My government has instructed me to withdraw all requests for council assistance in this matter. Terra will handle this situation through internal channels. The chamber fell silent. Several delegates looked puzzled, as if they expected her to say more, to plead perhaps, or to threaten to leave the council entirely. Instead, Ambassador gathered her papers and walked calmly toward the exit. Her aide followed, his face pale but determined. As they reached the door, she turned back one last time. "I want to thank the council once more for teaching Terra an important lesson about galactic politics," she said. "We will not forget it." After they left, the chamber erupted in discussion. Some delegates seemed relieved that the humans had finally accepted reality. Others worried that they might have pushed too hard, but most seemed to think the crisis was over. Sat in his seat long after the session ended, staring at the empty space where Ambassador had stood. In 3,000 years of diplomatic experience, he had learned to recognize many different kinds of anger. There was hot rage that burned bright and faded quickly. There was cold fury that planned and calculated. There was righteous indignation that demanded justice. What he had seen in Ambassador's eyes was something else entirely. It was not anger at all. It was the calm, terrible certainty of someone who had just made an irreversible decision. The council had taught the humans a lesson, just as Delegate Eth had said they would. But as reviewed what he knew of human history, he began to suspect that the lesson the humans had learned was not the one the council intended to teach. That night, sent a private message to his personal contacts throughout the galaxy. He asked them to monitor human activities and report anything unusual. He also increased his security detail and made sure his diplomatic immunity papers were up to date. His ancient instincts were screaming that something terrible was coming. The humans had been pushed past their breaking point, and if their history was any guide, the galaxy was about to learn why they had chosen the long peace in the first place. The storm was gathering, and feared that when it finally broke, nothing would be the same again. The silence began 3 days after the council's final vote. Ambassador noticed it first in small things. Human trade ships that had been constantly moving through galactic space suddenly stopped broadcasting their usual status updates. Scientific conferences that had been planned for months were quietly canceled without explanation. The friendly chatter that human diplomats normally shared with their colleagues across the galaxy simply disappeared. At first, other species assumed the humans were sulking about the council's decision. It would not be the first time a new species had withdrawn in anger after learning harsh lessons about galactic politics. Most expected them to return within a few weeks, humbled and ready to accept how things really worked. But as days turned into weeks, the silence deepened in ways that made increasingly nervous. All human civilian ships began returning to their home systems, every single one. Merchant vessels abandoned profitable trade routes. Exploration ships canceled deep space surveys. Research vessels studying alien phenomena suddenly declared their missions complete and headed home. When other species tried to contact human colonies or Earth itself, they received polite but cold responses. "Thank you for your inquiry. Terra is currently reviewing its diplomatic protocols. We will contact you when appropriate." The few human ships still moving through space had changed as well. They no longer carried the mixed crews of scientists, diplomats, and traders that had made them popular throughout the galaxy. Instead, they were crewed by humans who spoke very little and answered questions with single-word responses. When asked about their cargo or destination, they simply said unavailable and continued on their way. Most disturbing of all, these ships no longer appeared on long-range sensors the way they should. They seemed to flicker in and out of detection, as if they were using some kind of stealth technology that the humans had never shown before. Warprime OK was delighted by these developments. He broadcast victory messages throughout space, claiming that his attacks had frightened the humans so badly they were hiding in their own systems. He ordered his fleets to accelerate their conquest of former human trade routes and began planning raids on human colonies themselves. But remembered the look in Ambassador's eyes during that final council session. That had not been fear. It had been something far more dangerous. His network of contacts began reporting strange observations. Deep space monitoring stations detected massive energy signatures coming from the Sol system, but the readings made no sense. The power levels were impossible for any known technology, and the energy patterns matched nothing in any galactic database. Industrial worlds throughout human space had suddenly changed their production schedules. Factories that had been making farming equipment and medical supplies were now working around the clock on classified projects. When trade partners inquired about orders, they were told that all production was needed for internal requirements. Most unsettling were the reports about human personnel. Scientists who had been studying peaceful aliens were suddenly nowhere to be found. Diplomats who had spent years building friendships across the galaxy disappeared from social gatherings. Even human artists and musicians seemed to have vanished from the galactic cultural scene. The humans who remained visible were different. They were polite but distant, professional but cold. They answered questions with technical precision but shared no personal details, no friendly conversation, no hints about what their people were planning. Began spending his sleepless hours digging deeper into human history. What he found in their military archives made his scales crawl with fear. The humans had not just fought wars during their time of madness. They had revolutionized warfare itself. They had created weapons that turned planets into ash, diseases that could be programmed to target specific genetic markers, and machines that could think and kill without human guidance. But the weapons were not what terrified him. It was the strategies, the tactical thinking that had guided their use. Humans had shown a genius for finding weaknesses that others could not see and exploiting them with devastating efficiency. They had fought wars where they convinced their enemies to destroy themselves, where they turned strength into weakness and confidence into terror. One file made him sit back in shock. It described something called total war, where humans had mobilized every resource of their civilization for a single purpose: the complete destruction of their enemies. Not just military defeat, but the elimination of the enemy's ability to ever threaten them again. The humans had voluntarily abandoned these capabilities when they chose the long peace. They had locked away their weapons, classified their strategies, and chosen to present themselves to the galaxy as peaceful artists and scientists. But nothing in their history suggested they had forgotten how to wage war. They had simply chosen not to. Sent urgent messages to his contacts throughout the galaxy, warning them that something terrible might be coming. Most dismissed his concerns. The humans were clearly just angry about losing some ships to raiders. They would calm down eventually and return to normal diplomatic relations. Only a few understood the true danger. An ancient philosopher named responded with a message that chilled to his bones. I have touched the edges of human minds during their diplomatic missions. Beneath their peaceful thoughts, I sense something vast and dark, like an ocean of controlled fury. If that control ever breaks, the galaxy will burn. Warprime OK seemed oblivious to any danger. He continued his attacks on human colonies, finding them strangely easy to capture, as human defenders seemed to melt away before his forces arrived. He took this as proof of human cowardice and began planning even bolder strikes. See how the weak mammals flee before our might, he broadcast to the galaxy. Their pretty words and peaceful songs cannot save them from strength. But notice that the human colonies were not really being abandoned. The civilians were evacuated, yes, but careful analysis of the sensor data showed that something was being left behind in each location. Some kind of equipment or installations that did not match any known human technology. It was as if the humans were not fleeing from but were deliberately clearing the field for something else entirely. The breakthrough came when one of his contacts managed to intercept a partial transmission from deep space. The signal was heavily encrypted and lasted only seconds, but the translation software managed to decode a few words. Phase 1 complete. Subjects: initiate containment protocols. The language was cold, clinical, like a scientist discussing laboratory specimens rather than a military commander planning an attack. But the implications were terrifying. It suggested that everything that had happened so far was not a response to aggression, but a carefully planned operation. The humans had not been driven to fight. They had been gathering information, studying their enemies, preparing for something that they could not even imagine. That night sat in his chambers, staring out at the stars and wondering if he was about to witness the end of galactic civilization as he knew it. The humans had chosen peace for 200 years, but before that, they had shown themselves capable of horrors that made even hardened warriors tremble. Now they were silent, invisible, and planning something in the depths of their own territory. The galaxy had rejected their pleas for help and forced them to handle the problem themselves. Feared that the galaxy was about to learn why the humans had chosen the long peace in the first place. Not because they were weak, but because they knew exactly what they were capable of when they abandoned restraint. The storm was almost ready to break, and when it did, suspected that Warprime OK and his mighty hegemony were about to discover what happened when humans decided that mercy was no longer an option. In the growing darkness between the stars, something was moving, something that had been sleeping for 200 years but was now very much awake. The galaxy had taught the humans a lesson about power and politics. Now the humans were about to teach the galaxy a lesson about what real power actually looked like when it was unleashed without mercy or restraint. Closed his eyes and prayed to whatever gods might be listening that he would survive to see what came next. The first sign that everything had changed came from the mining outpost of 7. It was a small facility on the edge of their territory, staffed by 300 soldiers and workers. They had been celebrating their latest victory, drinking fermented blood wine and boasting about how easily they had conquered another human colony. Then the outpost simply stopped transmitting. Warprime OK was not immediately concerned. Communication failures happened, especially on frontier worlds where equipment was old and maintenance was poor. He sent a patrol ship to investigate, expecting to find broken transmitters or perhaps a minor accident. The patrol ship arrived at 7 to find the outpost completely intact but utterly empty. Every was gone. Their weapons remained in the armories, untouched. Food was still warm in the mess halls. Personal belongings were scattered around barracks as if their owners had simply vanished in the middle of daily activities. The only sign of human presence was a message burned into the metal wall of the command center. The words were in perfect script. "Your people are safe. Surrender, and they will remain so." OK's response was predictable fury. He assumed the humans had used some kind of cowardly trick, perhaps a sleeping gas that had allowed them to capture his people without a fight. He dispatched a full battle group to hunt down the human forces and rescue his soldiers. The battle group never made it to 7. 12 warships, each the size of a small city and armed with enough firepower to crack a moon, vanished somewhere between 2 star systems. No distress signals, no wreckage, no trace of what had happened to them. One day they were en route to their destination. The next day they simply did not exist anymore. Ambassador received the reports with growing dread. He had seen many military actions in his long life, but this was unlike anything in his experience. Entire military units were disappearing without any sign of battle or struggle. The pattern began to accelerate across space. Outposts went silent. Patrol fleets vanished. Border stations reported normal status one moment and were unreachable the next. In each case, any personnel who were found later appeared in escape pods near neutral territory, physically unharmed but mentally shattered. The survivors all told the same impossible story. They spoke of shadows that moved without making sound, of weapons that appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. Most disturbing of all, they claimed that they had never actually seen their attackers. "The darkness came alive," whispered one veteran who had fought in dozens of battles. "We fired at nothing and hit nothing. Our sensors showed clear space, but something was there. Something that knew exactly where we were and what we would do before we did it." Warprime OK refused to believe the reports. He accused his own soldiers of cowardice, and threatened to execute anyone who spread lies about invisible enemies. But even he could not ignore the evidence when his personal fortress world of came under attack. The fortress was considered absolutely impregnable. It was protected by orbital defense platforms, energy shields, and a garrison of 50,000 elite warriors. OK himself commanded the defense from his private command bunker, surrounded by his most loyal guards. The attack began at dawn, but it was unlike any assault in recorded military history. No ships appeared on sensors. No bombardment preceded the attack. Instead, systems simply began failing throughout the fortress. First, the orbital platforms stopped responding to commands. Then the energy shields flickered and died. Communications went dead. Transport systems shut down. Within hours, the most heavily defended installation in space was completely dark and silent. OK found himself trapped in his command bunker with a handful of guards, surrounded by technology that no longer obeyed his commands. The massive blast doors that protected the bunker had sealed shut, but not to keep attackers out. They had sealed to keep him in. When the doors finally opened 12 hours later, OK emerged to find his fortress empty. 50,000 warriors had vanished without a trace. The only evidence of human presence was another message, this one projected as a hologram in the main hall. A human woman appeared, wearing a simple uniform with no insignia. Her voice was calm and professional as she spoke in perfect dialect. Warprime OK, your military forces have been contained. Your soldiers are alive and unharmed in secured locations. You have 24 hours to surrender unconditionally. If you do not, we will begin Phase 2 of our operation. I strongly advise against forcing us to proceed to Phase 2. The hologram disappeared, leaving OK alone in his empty fortress, screaming challenges at enemies he could not see. Throughout the galaxy, intelligence services worked frantically to understand what was happening in space. The few long-range sensors that could penetrate the region showed impossible readings. Ships that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Energy patterns that matched no known technology. Most disturbing of all, some sensors detected what appeared to be massive structures moving through space, but visual confirmation showed nothing but empty vacuum. Received classified reports from his contacts in various intelligence agencies. The details were fragmentary but terrifying. Human forces seemed to be using technology that was decades ahead of anything the galaxy had ever seen. They struck with perfect precision, always knowing exactly where their enemies were and what they would do next. But the truly frightening part was not the technology, it was the strategy. The humans were not simply defeating forces. They were dismantling the entire hegemony with surgical precision. They targeted command structures, communication networks, and supply lines while carefully avoiding civilian populations. They captured rather than killed, contained rather than destroyed. It was not conquest. It was a controlled demolition carried out with inhuman efficiency. The operation reached its climax when OK finally attempted to rally his remaining forces for a desperate counterattack. He had managed to gather nearly 1,000 ships from across his territory, the largest fleet ever assembled. The fleet lasted exactly 17 minutes after entering the system, where they believed human forces were hiding. Observers at the edge of the system reported that the ships simply began powering down one by one, as if their crews had decided to surrender simultaneously. When rescue ships arrived hours later, they found the entire fleet intact but empty, drifting in perfect formation like a monument to some incomprehensible victory. The only ship that still had crew was OK's flagship, and it contained only the Warprime himself, locked in his personal quarters and babbling about machines that think like demons and enemies who fight like gods. That same day, human communication channels reopened for the first time in weeks. Ambassador's voice was broadcast across the galaxy, as calm and professional as if she was announcing a minor trade agreement. The aggressive actions of the hegemony against civilian targets have been addressed. All captured personnel will be returned to their territory within 48 hours. Normal diplomatic and trade relations may now resume. The message lasted less than 30 seconds. There was no boasting, no demands for tribute, no threats against others who might consider similar actions. The humans had dismantled the most powerful military force in 3 sectors and spoke about it as if they had resolved a minor administrative problem. Sat in his chambers, staring at the intelligence reports spread across his desk. In less than 3 weeks, the humans had achieved something that would have taken any other species months or years to accomplish. They had not just defeated they had made them disappear so completely that some observers wondered if the hegemony had ever really existed. But the most terrifying part was how little effort it had seemed to require. There were no reports of human casualties. No human ships had been destroyed or even damaged. The entire operation had been conducted with an efficiency that suggested the humans had been capable of this all along. They had chosen to ask for help not because they needed it, but because they preferred not to handle the problem themselves. The galaxy's refusal to assist had not forced them to find another way. It had simply removed their last reason to show mercy. As contemplated the implications, he received a final, classified report that made his ancient blood turn cold. According to deep space sensors, the massive energy signatures coming from human space had not decreased after the operation ended. If anything, they had grown stronger. Whatever the humans had used to destroy the hegemony, it was still active, still growing, still waiting in the darkness between the stars. The galaxy had seen only a small demonstration of what Earth was capable of when pushed beyond patience. Closed his eyes and tried not to imagine what Phase 2 might have involved. 3 days after the last outpost went silent, War Prime OK arrived at Nexus Prime in a battered escape pod. The once mighty leader of the hegemony was not the same being who had terrorized the Outer Rim. His scales had turned pale gray, the color of fear among his people. His massive claws trembled when he spoke. His eyes darted constantly around the room as if expecting invisible enemies to emerge from the shadows. Ambassador watched from the observation deck as Council security forces escorted the broken warlord to a holding cell. OK kept mumbling the same words over and over. They were everywhere and nowhere. How do you fight what you cannot see? How do you defeat what you cannot understand? The irony was not lost on. For months, OK had broadcast his contempt for human weakness. Now he was begging the Council for protection from the very species he had dismissed as harmless dreamers. The emergency session that followed was unlike anything in the Council's history. For the first time that anyone could remember, the Great Hall was completely silent as Ambassador entered. Every delegate watched her with expressions ranging from awe to terror. She walked to her seat with the same calm professionalism she had always shown, but something fundamental had changed. The other delegates no longer saw a representative of a peaceful species asking for help. They saw someone who could make entire military forces disappear without explanation. Waited patiently as the session was called to order, her hands folded in her lap, her expression pleasantly neutral. She might have been attending a routine trade discussion, rather than explaining how her people had just dismantled the most feared military power in 3 sectors. Honored delegates, she began when recognized by the Council speaker, I am pleased to report that the recent difficulties in the Outer Rim have been resolved. All captured personnel have been returned safely to their territory. Trade routes are now secure for all galactic traffic. She paused, looking around the chamber with the same friendly smile she had worn during her first address to the Council. Terra wishes to express our gratitude to the Council for allowing us to handle this matter internally. We have learned much about galactic politics from this experience. The silence stretched on for long seconds. Finally, Delegate Eth found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. How, he asked, how did you destroy them so completely? Ambassador tilted her head slightly, as if confused by the question. I'm sorry, Delegate Eth, but I'm not sure what you mean. We didn't destroy anyone. As I mentioned, all personnel have been safely returned to their families. But their fleet, their outposts, their entire military structure. "Oh, that," said with a slight shrug. "Yes, we had to disable some equipment that was being used to attack civilian targets. We tried to be as gentle as possible in the process." Gentle, she had called the complete dismantling of a star-spanning empire gentle. Rose from his seat, his ancient bones creaking as he stood. He had remained silent through too many of these sessions, watching and worrying while others made decisions that led to disaster. Not this time. "Honored colleagues," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 3 of experience. "I have served this council longer than most of your civilizations have existed. I have seen the rise and fall of empires, witnessed the birth of technologies beyond imagination, and watched species who thought themselves immortal crumble to dust." He looked directly at Ambassador, who met his gaze with polite attention, as if he were discussing the weather. "But I have never, in all my long years, seen anything as terrifying as what we have just witnessed." The chamber remained silent, but could feel the attention of every delegate focusing on his words. The humans did not simply defeat the hegemony of. They dismantled it like a child taking apart a toy, so completely and efficiently that we still do not understand how they accomplished it. They made an entire military force disappear without losing a single ship, without firing a shot that any of our sensors could detect. He turned to address the full chamber, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We have made a grave error, my friends, a mistake that could have cost us everything. We assumed that because humans choose peace, they are incapable of war. We thought that because they prefer art to armies, they must be weak. We believed that their kindness was the same as helplessness." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried to every corner of the vast hall. "We were wrong, catastrophically, dangerously wrong." He gestured toward Ambassador, who continued to listen with the same pleasant attention she might give to a poetry reading. "The humans have not shown us their strength today. They have shown us their mercy. They chose to demonstrate their power rather than use it, to contain rather than destroy, to disable rather than annihilate. They return to their diplomacy and their art because they choose to do so, not because they have no other options." The old ambassador's voice began to rise again, carrying a warning that echoed through the chamber and across the galaxy. "The most dangerous predator is not the one that hunts for sport, but the one that hunts only when necessary. When such a creature finally strikes, it remembers exactly what it is capable of. The humans have been the galaxy's most patient species, its most forgiving, its most willing to turn the other cheek when attacked." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final warning. "They have also just proven themselves to be the galaxy's most capable killers when they finally decide that patience has run its course." Looked around the chamber one more time, meeting the eyes of delegates who were beginning to understand the true scope of what had just happened. "We rejected their pleas for help. We forced them to handle the problem themselves. We taught them that the galaxy respects only strength and that mercy is seen as weakness. They have learned these lessons very well." His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Remember this moment, all of you. Remember it well. The humans have shown us today that their civilization is built not on inability to wage war, but on the conscious choice not to. They have demonstrated that their peaceful nature is not a limitation but a gift they give to the rest of us." The chamber was so quiet that the soft hum of the life support systems sounded like thunder. "We have been living in the shadow of the galaxy's most perfect predators, and they have been protecting us from themselves out of kindness alone. Today, they reminded us what happens when that kindness is withdrawn." His final words rang through the chamber like a funeral bell. "Gods help you when humans go mad, my friends. Because when they finally abandon mercy, gods are the only ones powerful enough to save you." He sat down slowly, leaving the chamber in stunned silence. For long minutes, no one spoke. No one moved. The reality of what they had witnessed was too enormous to process quickly. Finally, Ambassador stood and addressed the chamber one last time. "If I may," she said with her characteristic politeness. "I would like to assure the Council that Terra remains committed to peace and cooperation with all galactic species. We hope that recent events will help prevent similar tragedies in the future." She smiled warmly at the assembled delegates, the same friendly expression she had worn when first joining the Council. "We look forward to continuing our work together to build a galaxy where all thinking beings can live in harmony." With that, she gathered her papers and walked calmly out of the chamber, leaving behind a room full of delegates who were finally beginning to understand the true nature of the species they had so casually dismissed. In the days that followed, the galaxy would learn to look at humans differently. Trade agreements were negotiated more fairly. Diplomatic requests were answered more promptly. When human aid ships appeared in systems struck by disaster, local authorities cleared space lanes and provided whatever assistance was needed. The long peace, it turned out, had never been about human weakness. It had been about human choice, and the galaxy had just learned what happened when humans were forced to choose differently. Filed his final report on the incident with a single recommendation. In all future dealings with Terra, remember that their greatest strength has always been their restraint. The galaxy's survival may depend on ensuring they never have cause to abandon it again. The message was classified at the highest levels and distributed to intelligence services throughout known space. It contained only 5 words, but they changed galactic politics forever. "Do not anger the humans.